Black workers in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. We feature cutting-edge voices in economics who bring their research to bear on one of today's most pressing policy challenges, increasing wages to reduce income inequality so that the coronavirus recession does not exacerbate long-term trends in inequality and a post-pandemic recovery is resilient and broadly shared. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping notes. All questions about the event's content go into the Q&A box, but technical and logistic questions go into the chat box. In the Q&A box, when asking questions for the panelists, please give your first and last name along with your institution or workplace, and if the question is for a specific person, please indicate to whom your question is directed. The event is on the record and being recorded. I would now like to turn to someone who has a deep understanding of the institutional and political forces shaping economic inequality today, our keynote speaker, Congressman Bobby Scott. Congressman Scott has represented Virginia's 3rd Congressional District in the U.S. House of Representatives since 1993. Congressman Scott has the distinction of being the first African-American elected to Congress from the Commonwealth of Virginia since Reconstruction, and only the second African-American elected to Congress in Virginia's history. He's also the first American with Filipino ancestry to serve as a voting member of Congress. Congressman Scott serves on the Budget Committee, where he's a leading voice on fiscal policy and will continue to play a key role in shaping Congress's response to the coronavirus recession. Congressman Scott also currently serves as the chairman of the Committee on Education and Labor. In this capacity, he's been advancing an agenda that improves equity in education, frees students from the burdens of crippling debt, protects and expands access to affordable healthcare, ensures workers have a safe workplace where they can earn a living wage free from discrimination, and guarantees seniors a secure and dignified retirement. He's also been a champion of raising the federal minimum wage in particular, which is a critical tool in reducing wage inequality and reducing gender and racial wage gaps. Moreover, throughout his political career, he's been a champion of policies to promote racial justice and civil rights, with an understanding of how this is a critical aspect of an equitable economy too. This is a cornerstone of the work we do at Equitable Growth to understand and promote policies that reduce economic inequality by race, ethnicity, and gender. With that, I would like to thank the Congressman for joining us today, and I really look forward to hearing your remarks on labor policy in the new Congress. Please take it away.
Thank you, Kate, for your very kind introduction. And I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. I want to thank the Washington Center for Equitable Growth for inviting me to speak today and for your important work to support our economy and communities. And also want to recognize everyone who contributed to this timely essay series on how policymakers can help boost the wages of our nation's workers. This discussion couldn't come at a more critical time as workers and students continue to weather the economy and the economic emergency caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. But as you know, our nation's wage and employment disparities did not begin with COVID-19. To meaningfully help our workers, we have to address the underlying structures that have been working against workers since way before the pandemic. One of the most significant steps to take, as you've already mentioned, is increasing the minimum wage. Hadn't been done for 10 years, the longest stretch in the history of the minimum wage. Today, the minimum wage has been so eroded that according to one study, a full-time 40-hour-a-week minimum wage worker cannot afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment in any county in the United States. I didn't say New York City or downtown San Francisco, not a single county in the United States where a full-time minimum wage worker can afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment. And so I worked with Congress last year to support the Raise the Wage Act. It passed the House with great bipartisan support. The legislation would gradually raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025 and index future increases to the median wage growth, so that you don't have to wait for politics to catch up. The minimum wage would be automatically increased. It also would establish one fair wage so that tip workers aren't undermined, youth workers, and workers with disabilities would all be guaranteed the full federal minimum wage. By taking these steps, the minimum wage, the Raise the Wage Act would increase wages for up to 33 million workers and lift 1.3 million workers out of poverty, including about 600,000 children. So we look forward to reintroducing the bill this year with a different Senate, so hopefully a different result in the Senate, finally achieving this critical priority for our nation's worker. I wanted to point out, of course, this is not a remarkable bill. A lot of states are already well on their way to the provisions in the bill without a federal law. This essay series, as it notes, policymakers can and must go beyond just increasing the minimum wage. There are other things we have to do, and one is to restore a meaningful right to organize. For generations, strong collective bargaining rights have been ensured that workers can form a union and negotiate for higher pay, better benefits, safer working conditions, and the ability to retire with dignity. But regrettably, concerted attacks on union organizing have eroded union density for over 30%, from 30% around World War II to a mere 10% now. And the law is too weak to defer illegal union busting. So we know that the decline in union membership is not a reflection of workers' choices. One poll showed that across the country, nearly half of non-union workers said they would join a union if given the opportunity. But regrettably, that opportunity isn't there because the law has not been kept up to date. That's why last Congress, both House Democrats and Republicans voted to pass the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or the PRO Act, which is the most comprehensive legislation in recent history to protect workers' collective bargaining rights. Legislation will make critical reforms to the National Labor Relations Act by authorizing meaningful penalties for companies that violate their workers' right to organize, and close loopholes that corporations use to misclassify workers and evade their obligations to bargain, push back on state right to work laws, which we know undermine the right to organize, and ensure that workers can decide whether or not to form a union without employer interference. People wear the slogan that join a union should be a right, not a fight. Simply put, House Democrats recognize that when we strengthen workers' collective bargaining rights, we strengthen the economy and the entire country. And so we look forward to the passage of the PRO Act, and also look forward to restoring the rights of public workers to organize after the Janus decision. We have a lot of work to do in that area. Beyond restoring workers' rights to organize, Congress must also take bold steps to expand basic workplace protections for all workers. And so we're working towards that goal. One is the Paycheck Fairness Act, Equal Paycheck, and other bills that will guarantee that people who have earned their paycheck won't have it sabotaged because of discrimination by race, gender, or other protected classes. We'll be working on that. We're also pleased that this series touches on the need to improve our higher education system. We know that the best jobs go to those with the best education, but it is clear now that the quality post-secondary education, which is the surest way to financial security and a rewarding career, is regrettably beyond the economic affordability of a lot of people. When President Johnson signed the Higher Education Act in 1965, he essentially said it would mean that any student in any state could apply to any college and university and not be turned away because the family was poor. And that's the way it was back then. The Pell Grant covered about 80% of the cost of going to college. The states were paying about 2/3 of the cost of public colleges. Now states are paying about 1/3, and the Pell Grant covers about 30%. And then if people wonder where all these student loans are coming from, that's why, because the difference is having to be made up by the students. And a lot of people, it's just a regrettable situation. They're calculating they can't afford to go to college. That's why last Congress, the committee proposed the College Affordability Act as part of the comprehensive reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. It would lower the cost of college for students. would improve the quality of higher education and expand opportunities for students of all backgrounds. Regrettably, the pandemic has put affordable post-secondary education even further out of reach, particularly for low-income students and minorities who face the greatest barriers to complete their education even before the pandemic. College resources that students normally rely on to pursue their education are more limited when on-campus operations are suspended. And so millions of students are at the risk of falling behind academically as institutions continue to adapt to distance learning. Those with the weakest academic preparation are most likely to fall behind when it's all distance learning. So we have a lot of work to do, and institutions are grappling with the drastic need to deal with the decreased enrollment, severe funding cuts and revenue losses, the effects of state disinvestment. And so the Higher Education Act reauthorization, the College Affordability Act, is designed to deal with that. One of the things we do in the bill is create a federal state partnership to incentivize states to reinvest in public colleges and provide tuition-free community college, increase the value of the Pell Grants, make student loans less expensive, easy to pay off, and expand support services so that to help students complete their education. These are just a few of the steps that Democrats are taking in the College Affordability Act. And if we do all that we know how to do, a lot more students will have the opportunity to get higher education. One of the things that we recognize is that everybody's not going to a four-year liberal arts college. So when we say higher education, we're including apprenticeships, and we owe a training under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Make sure everybody has an opportunity, whether they're getting a four-year degree or some kind of job training. And before we leave income inequality, wealth inequality is closely attached, and that is the housing opportunities have to be part of the strategy. Most middle-class families develop their wealth in the equity of their home. We are finding or revealing through books and many articles that the federal government was complicit in the denial of home ownership opportunities to African Americans over the years since the 1930s and 40s. And so we have an obligation to make sure that home ownership opportunities are there so that everybody can develop wealth. And that's going to certainly be a challenge. But we're optimistic about a lot of these opportunities. We're optimistic when people start talking about these issues and organizations make them their priorities. So I want to thank you for your dedication in improving the lives of our nation's workers. President Biden is in the process now of announcing many initiatives, which will be right down kind of things that you're talking about. So we look forward to working with you as we achieve our mutual goals and making sure that the income and wealth inequalities are addressed and that people have equal opportunities going forward. So Kate, thank you for the opportunity to be with you, and look forward to working with you and getting this job done.
Great, thank you so much, Congressman Scott. I really appreciate how you tied all these issues together, which is sort of exactly the premise of this series. So I really appreciate your remarks. For those of you just joining us, I'm Kate Bond. I'm the Director of Labor Market Policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Next, we have our first fireside chat where I'll be speaking with Dr. Ioana Marinescu, one of the contributors to this book. Ioana is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research covers monopsonic labor markets and wage determination, the economic impact of policies like unemployment insurance and minimum wages, and employment contracts. She's also just generally a prolific writer and researcher, so I'm so glad she's part of this series. Her essay in the series is titled, Boosting Wages When the US Labor Markets Are Not Competitive. Welcome, Ioana.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody.
So just to start, I want to give you a chance to give a brief overview of your essay for the attendees.
All right, so everybody, I'm going to share my screen so that you can more easily follow my key points. So, as Kate just said, we're going to talk about how you can boost wages, specifically noting that labor markets in the US are not competitive. So the big point here is that there's a fact, which is that workers are often underpaid. And why is that? Because there's a lack of competition among employers, which the technical term for that is monopsony, which is similar to monopoly that you might be more familiar with for product markets. And so how do we know that? Well, first, there's evidence that workers are not very sensitive to wages. And in particular, this implies that they're not going to quit, even if they're underpaid, which allows and enables employers to underpay them. And secondly, the majority of US labor markets are highly concentrated, as I'll show you a picture in a moment, meaning that few employers or just a few large employers dominate the market. So workers don't have many options of other employers they could go to in order to get a wage boost. So what do we do about this? The first and obvious solution, because it's a competition problem, is to apply antitrust policy. So the first thing to do then is to strengthen antitrust enforcement. And one aspect of that follows directly is that merger reviews, when two companies merge, thereby becoming bigger and a bigger player in the labor market, that diminishes competition. So this should be examined by the federal antitrust authorities, and anti-competitive effects on the labor market should be taken into account. And this is work that the federal agencies have already started to do, influenced, among other things, by my own research. And then we also need stronger enforcement against employer monopsony across the board. And for that, I have a legislative proposal that you can find some of the details of that in my piece. Then, besides antitrust, which is the obvious solution, there's some other policies that actually, Congressman talked about that are also useful here. One is to increase the minimum wage. Now, if workers are underpaid, as we just argued, that means employers can afford to pay more. And even if we increase the minimum wage, we're not going to lose jobs. And secondly, unions, and more generally, any policy that increases worker bargaining power, what the evidence shows is that specifically, unions can raise wages by counteracting employer monopsony power, meaning this ability that employers have to underpay people because there's not many other options and people aren't going to quit. When you have a union in the firm, it's able to largely counteract that. And so this is how unions can help here. And then I'm gonna, just conclude by quickly showing you this picture of labor market concentration. And so all these orange and red zones in the US are the most concentrated labor markets, meaning that they have few employers or just a few, even if there are many employers, big employers completely dominate the market. And you'll see that it's mostly more rural and less densely populated areas. So I think that's also something worth thinking about. All right, this is what I had just as a brief summary. And Kate, I look forward to your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ioana. There's one point you touched on earlier in your remarks that I want to dig into a little bit more when you mentioned something about pay sensitivity. So why is it important to understand how pay sensitive workers are, and what does this tell us about the overall condition of the labor market?
Right. So, the way to think about this is that in a perfectly competitive labor market, which is what economists usually have in mind, it's jobs are like, beers or whatever. Like there's just so many options. You can just grab one around the corner. And if you don't like this one, then just go get another one. There's one right next door that's essentially the same, right? So that's the idea. There's infinitely many jobs that are good for you that you could go grab. So if any employer decides to underpay you, you're like, I'm out of here. Right. So, but that's not the situation in the labor market for most people in most circumstances, because again, like people might have fewer other employers they could go to, and they might care about very specific aspects of the job, including, for example, how close the job is to their homes. So because of those kinds of aspects where not every job is the same, there's only a limited number of jobs that would be right for me. That means that my current employer has the ability to underpay me because they know that my other options are worse or might not even exist. So that's, sensitivity to pay is low when there's not a lot of competition because I'm kind of stuck. This is what I have. There's not really something better out there. If there was a ton of competition, perfectly competitive, like we usually see the markets as economists, this sensitivity would be infinite, or extremely high. So if you underpay me just a little bit, as I said, I'm going to leave, or I'm just not going to come to you if you don't offer a competitive pay, right? And employers often talk about that. And in big cities, we're closer to that situation. In very large city, common types of jobs, we're closer to that situation. But in many cases, that's definitely not how the market works. And again, if workers are not very sensitive to wages, which we call low elasticity in technical terms, that allows for employers to underpay them.
Great, thank you. And just like, if you'll allow me the opportunity to elaborate on some of that too, that, you said you had this one line about people might care about the specific aspects of jobs. And so that is part of what would contribute to low pay sensitivity. And I think one way to think about this as well too is like the way economists think about preferences too, sometimes are actually constraints. And so there's a lot of research showing that the gender wage gap may be partially explained by monopsony. And the way I would think about that is you care about the aspects of the job, but it's partially because of the constraint imposed by women who tend to take on the majority of caretaking. So some of these things that we see as preferences as economists truly are reflecting some like longstanding structural inequality that shape people's preferences. So that's just my small note on top of that. And so, as you noted, there's increasing evidence monopsony is a broad phenomenon. It's across the country, as you showed in your graph, and it's caused by a variety of factors. So what do you see as some of the causes of monopsony, and how does this help us understand where antitrust would be most effective, or where other worker power policies that you described, like unions and minimum wages, would have the greatest effect?
Right. So, we've seen that there's many reasons why workers have few options, and some of them are kind of just how the situation tends to be. For example, in less densely populated areas, there might just not be a lot of employers there. Of course, policy could try to address that, but that's just the situation. But in some cases, this lack of competition is created by behavior that is intentional on employer side in order to reduce competition. And behaviors like that include, for example, wage fixing, where employers agree on the level of pay and not paying more when they compete with each other. Or there might be no poaching agreements, where I'm saying like, hey, I'm not going to try to hire your workers, which also allows the employer to underpay you since the competitor isn't going to hire your way. And that's where antitrust comes in, to curb these kinds of behaviors on the part of employers, which, by the way, are illegal. So just to make it transparently clear, wage fixing and no poaching agreements are a per se antitrust violation. Like that's just illegal. But it's happening out there. And as I already suggested, there's not a lot of enforcement of antitrust in labor markets. So that can even more easily happen because there's nobody really watching and trying to fix this. So the first line of approach that's obvious here is to really boost our labor antitrust enforcement. And it would clearly be very efficient in the sense that, right now we have almost no enforcement. There's a little bit, but it's quite limited. And so starting from almost zero, there's a lot of opportunity to grow and find egregious cases that could be pursued. And by the way, without changing any legislation, because this is already encompassed in the notion of what a competitive labor market or any market should be according to antitrust principles. So that's really the first line of approach. Now, with our proposed legislation, we propose legislation that, for codification would just make this work a bit easier by resolving any uncertainty about how antitrust might apply to labor market. It does apply, but of course, as usual, when there's little precedent, there might be some uncertainty. And this is where legislation could come in handy, as well as potentially at the margin reinforcing certain aspects. So that's really one of the first lines of approach. And it's very easy to do because we already have the legislation there that's existed for, more than a century now to take a stance. And all that needs to do really is to beef up enforcement, which is very much feasible. And then there's this other policy. Okay, but so this is going to have an impact, especially to curb the behavior of employers, which I don't mean to imply is the majority, but bad actors who are doing these kinds of things, and they need to be brought in line with the law. And that also means it creates a disincentive for others who might want to envision doing things like that, to tell them, hey, like, if you're going to do this, we're going to come after you. So that's one. But of course, as I said, I don't necessarily think the majority of employers are consciously trying to engage in this kind of illegal behavior. So that's where other policies can also come in handy, such as the minimum wage is going to especially help low-paid workers and boost their wages, as they're currently, many of them are underpaid. Boosting up wages is going to allow them to make more without killing jobs, because employers in fact can afford to pay more. Now, so that's important, and it's going to especially help low-wage workers, and especially workers who are already in markets that are not very competitive, such as low-density areas. Right. And then unions, the advantage of the union, or just more like general policies to boost worker power, is that can now help everybody, as long as you're a member, no matter if you're lower pay or middle pay, the union is there to help boost your wage, even in the face of pressure from employers or circumstances that don't give you personally the bargaining power to boost your wage. So through collective bargaining, as we call it, that kind of gives you more power to be able to boost your wage. And as I mentioned, the research shows that unions are an effective antidote to downward wage pressure from employers who don't face a lot of competition in their labor market.
Great. Thank you so much, Ioana. And one thing I think is also like an exciting theoretical conclusion of monopsony is you noted how not only does it mean that employers can actually afford to pay more since they're technically underpaying workers, but in the theoretical model of monopsony, they can pay more while also employing more people if we sort of use these policy tools you described to, correct the effect of monopsony.
That's right. And just I want to emphasize, this might seem counterintuitive, but the basic intuition about why making employers pay more could actually even boost employment is that essentially, employers currently, some of them would rather exploit workers a lot and accept that not a lot of workers are going to come to them and get exploited. But they're making so much profit per worker that they're willing to take that deal, just employ the few who are going to work hard because this is their only option, and underpay them massively. If you force them to pay more, they're going to be willing and able to attract some additional workers who otherwise wouldn't come and put themselves in this situation because the pay is not enough. So with higher pay, they will be able and willing to attract more people. They're willing because anyway, they can't underpay anymore. So while we're at it, we might just also employ a few more people. So that's how, in principle, we're able to increase jobs. And it's not just in principle. My own work shows that, in fact, in markets that have low competition, according to labor market concentration, boosts in the minimum wage, in fact, did increase employment. So it's not only what the theory predicts, but we've seen that happening on the ground in the US.
Great, thank you so much, Ioana. And for my last question for our chat, I want to sort of extend from that a little bit. If you can describe sort of what you predict the broader macroeconomic effects would be of effective antitrust enforcement, or broadly speaking, just correcting for monopsony.
Right, so overall, we can expect any of those actions to increase wages, although the affected groups would be a bit different, as I described earlier. And so in general, we can expect that wages will increase. And so, that obviously is going to have a positive effect on the economy as far as worker economic security, as well as potentially also boosting consumption for workers who are able to make more. And that can also have potential positive spillover effects for businesses that these workers patronize.
Great. Thank you so much, Ioana.
Absolutely.
I love your essay, and I always really appreciate this conversation with you. And we'll see you again for the Q&A. So next we have our second fireside chat, which is US labor markets require a new approach to higher education. And it'll be moderated by my colleague, Liz Hipple, who's a senior policy advisor at Equitable Growth. We'll take a minute here to set up for that conversation, and we'll be right back.
Hello, everyone. I'm Liz Hipple, Senior Policy Advisor here at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. And I'm joined here today by Dr. Andria Smythe. Andria is an assistant professor of economics at Howard University and another one of the contributors to this great collection of essays. So welcome, Andria.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you again for joining us. I'm really excited for our conversation today. So to kick things off, I wanted to ask if you could begin by just giving us a brief overview of some of the main points in your essay, particularly for policymakers.
Sure. So let me go ahead and share my screen real quick. I have a few slides. Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I am going to talk about the role of higher education, but thinking about kind of the underlying structures of the economy and the role that the higher education sector can play. So what I do, I try to make this a case for renewed public investment in higher education. And a big part of the issue with the current labor market are these inequitable outcomes, right? So we have, especially the recovery since the 2008 recession has been characterized by a rise in low-wage jobs and kind of a falling out of middle-wage jobs. And what that means, it requires lower-wage workers to kind of make a bigger leap to get to those higher-wage jobs. And what we need are policies that will, one, provide opportunities for all Americans, but also supply labor markets with skillful workers, but also workers that are agile enough to keep up with rapid technological change. And then finally, to provide the basis for a broader scale and scope of jobs that are being created. And I argue that the higher education sector occupies a strategic position to face these challenges. And I highlight in this essay some 3 challenges that are facing the current higher education sector. The first one are that the private returns to higher education, they're large, but they're not shared equally. And generally we see low-income individuals have less access to essentially the best public colleges that do a good job of moving people from lower income to higher income. And also by race and ethnicity. There's a lot of issues with equitable returns there. Also, I talked about the public returns that come to research and development performed by university. And a lot of the localized benefits to universities are in the local area in which the universities are located. But one of the biggest point of the essay that I wanted to make is this idea that many individuals who are in school are also workers, right? So there's a huge overlap, and we have a student worker. So I wanted to focus on the experience of the student workers here. And essentially the points I'm making here is that higher tuition combined with low wages are actually trapping students in this, what I call the high tuition, low wage trap. And a lot of these student workers are trying to escape the student debt trap. So now they end up in this low wage, high tuition trap. So essentially the high tuition forces individuals to remain in the labor market that's already saturated, and it reduces their bargaining power with their employers. So we see not only low wages, but also precarious schedulings, unpredictable scheduling. So this affects not only a worker's ability to complete college, but also to bargain with their employers. And so I wanted to talk about some of the policies that can address these issues for workers and transform the economy that works for everyone. And I draw from some lessons from policies from the past. The historic Land Grant Act famously talked about, providing opportunities for sons and daughters of toil. We need to bring back that type of rhetoric into the higher education sector. We also need to focus on not just how many college degrees we're producing, but for whom. So a focus on equity by race and ethnicity and geography, and then focus on exploration, innovation, and completion during the individual schooling period, and some policies that will get at these outcomes rather than credentialism. But overall, the essay is making the point that in the past, we have this broad public investment in what was considered a public good. And if we return to that type of model, it will benefit not just low-wage workers, but society as a whole. And I'll stop there. We can discuss more during the chat and the Q&A.
That was great. Thank you so much, Andria. And that actually sets up some of the questions that I wanted to dig in a bit more with you about very well. So the first one that I had for you is actually directly relevant to the graph you shared of the increase in the number of hours that you have to work to actually be able to afford college. One of the most striking statistics I found in your essay was that nearly 80% of part-time students and 50% of full-time students work while studying for an undergraduate degree. And at the same time, as your graph showed, the number of hours that they actually would have to work to afford an undergraduate degree has increased from 400 hours in 1970 to over 1,000 hours today. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what are the implications of this for students and would-be students, and also for the labor market.
Right, so as I mentioned, there's competition for these workers' time, right? So school and work competing for the individual's time. And what happens when tuition is high, it increases the supply of labor among that group who also would like to be studying. And as we talk about, it's a large proportion of students who are also workers. And what that does by increasing the labor supply of those workers, it actually puts downward pressure on wages. One, because students are kind of trapped because they need the extra income in order to pay for college. And because the value of their work is so low, they have to put in even more work hours. So it is no wonder a lot of these students are what we call economically inactive. They're neither in school nor working because the cost of higher ed is so high, but the value of the labor is so low, right? So we have a lot of discouraged workers especially amongst young adults. But it's not just young adults, because of a lot of individuals over 25 also work while studying, and so those dynamics affect them as well.
One thing that I also was struck about in your essay was you talk about the racial equity implications of this as well, and in particular, how the sticker price of college, the amount that you see displayed on a university's website about how much it costs to go there, can be a real deterrent to students, even if they are eligible for financial aid, which would mean that it would actually be significantly less money for them to attend. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that dynamic as well. And again, particularly what the implications of that are from a racial equity perspective.
Right, so a big issue with college completion, we see a role for information, right? So especially if for first generation students who might not have the type of information they would need, it requires, people always joke that it requires a college degree to learn the process to get into college, right? And a lot of first generation students do not have that in their home. So seeing a sticker price for college, they are less likely to even apply. They assume, oh, I cannot afford it. And even if they do apply into the system, they will apply to schools that have less resources. So they essentially undermatch. Whereas if they had applied to a higher match school, they would have more resources and more support where they can graduate. So the sticker price really discourages students from applying and from applying to colleges where they would be more likely to have a favorable outcome.
Shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to turn to one of the other points that you highlighted from your essay and your opening remarks, which was how there are actually many past examples of policies that we could look to for examples for how to increase access to higher education. Again, especially from the perspective of wanting to increase geographic, income, and racial diversity in those who are attending college. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about those historical policy examples.
Well, you know, I'm drawing on the famous ones. When I'm drawing on the famous ones when the Land Grant Act was being implemented. Of course, there are a lot of positive lessons we can learn there. It really revolutionized the higher education sector, and the idea that, you know, students from very poor backgrounds, they can do well, and they can do well in college if they're given a chance, right? So the mistakes that were made there in terms of not ensuring access for Black students around that time. And of course, in subsequent periods, policymakers would go back and make that and address that, right? That's where a lot of public HBCUs were established. Same thing with the GI Bill, the idea that you know, people of their country should have the opportunity to go to college once they're trying to be reintroduced into the economy. But again, we made some mistakes there where a lot of Black veterans were excluded from those policies. And so, and again, of course, with the Higher Education Act, it really opens access, broad access to a mass amount of students. But a lot of the issues that surrounded that in terms of using loans instead of grants have left a lot of especially low-income minority students with almost $2 trillion student debt burden. So now it's still not too late to go back and make that right? So, but the policy designs that we come up with going forward should actually feature equity from the outset, rather than making a mistake and fixing it a couple days or a couple of years or decades later.
So in my final question for you, I actually want to touch on both what you were just saying, but then also your earlier point about how these ideas, both in your essay and then the historical policies such as the GI Bill, we're all tied together by this idea that this is, you know, public investment for the common good. And in particular, you know, you have said also that, you know, part of one of the challenges that we face right now in our higher education system is it's framed entirely in terms of a private investment for private returns. So I was wondering if you could tell us, you know, how do you see this as an example? You know, what basically is the good for the entire economy of investing in higher education and making it more affordable and accessible for more people?
Right. So, you know, the research is showing that one, we'll talk about the private returns. It's still very high private returns accrue to the individual, right? And as economists, we took that and we ran with it and say, well, if it's a private investment with private returns, then the individual should pay for it. But what we have done is ignored a lot of the public returns to college education. And one of the reasons why it's been ignored is because a lot of those social returns are hard to quantify. And as economists, we like numbers. So if we can't quantify it, we ignore it, right? So we can think about one, you know, positive spillovers from having a parent with a high school, with a college degree, right? But also, even for people who do not go to college, being in the labor market with a high proportion of college graduates actually improve productivity for those individuals, right? You can think of greater productivity overall for the economy. When you think about the research and development that goes on in a lot of university campuses and spillovers for the local economy. But most of all, some of the areas that we can quantify, they're actually high fiscal returns to investing in college degrees. Right now, conservative estimates are about 25% returns fiscally, which means that the returns that the country gets from investing in college graduates far outweighs the cost of what it would pay to get that college degree.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me, Andria. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this in the Q&A.
Thank you.
So up next, we are going to have our third and final fireside chat, which is public investments in social insurance, education, and childcare can overcome market failures to promote family and economic well-being. This will be moderated by my colleague, Alex Goldworth, who is Equitable Growth's Director for Family Economic Security. And I'd also like to remind everyone that since this is going to be our final fireside chat, which will be followed by the Q&A period with all three of the authors featured here today. So go ahead and please start putting your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So we're going to take a moment to set up for our third fireside chat. Thank you, everyone.
All right, hello everyone. I'm Alex Gouldworth. I'm the Director of Family Economic Security Policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, and I'm so excited to be here today with Dr. Jesse Rothstein. Hey, Jesse. Jesse is a professor of public policy and economics at the University of California, Berkeley, and he is the faculty director at the California Policy Lab. Jesse is also the co-leader of this essay series through Berkeley's Institute for Research on Labor and Employment. So the essay that Jesse is going to talk about today is co-authored with Dr. Sandra E. Black, a professor of economic and international and public affairs at Columbia University. So Jesse, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I've had the pleasure of reading your co-authored essay, but many people in our audience have not yet. So could you start out by just telling us a bit about the piece?
Sure. So we argue that there are a large number of pretty substantial costs that we more or less just dump on families and ask them to take care of that don't really make much sense for us to make family responsibilities, that it's inefficient or it leads to distorting behavior. And it really creates a large amount of economic risk for families that would be better insured against by government programs that protect families from these risks. And so we talk about a number of categories of events, of risks that people face. And we divide them into two broad groups. There's a group called, that we think about as expanding social insurance. These are risks that families face, that the fact that they face those risks requires them to do things that really reduce their well-being. It put aside large amounts of savings just in case a risk comes along, a bad event comes along, or otherwise, for long-term care was one that we talk about. You talk about people as they're approaching old age will really manage a lot of their assets to make sure that they can go bankrupt in order to qualify for Medicaid if they need long-term care. That doesn't make any sense. It's really bad for the families, it's bad for our economy, and it's bad for the government budget. And we would all be better off if people had a way of being protected from that, and if we had public social insurance for that. The cost that we would pay for the social insurance would be much smaller than the benefits that families would obtain from it. The other category we talk about is one that ties closely to the previous essay, is policies to invest in children. There are big costs that parents face or that young adults face. It's part of getting children ready to participate in society. They're very concentrated at certain ages. So if you have infants and toddlers, you've got to pay enormous amounts of money for early child care, and that's necessary if particularly mothers are going to participate in the labor market. But the costs are outside of the reach of many families and require really families to save up in order to have children, and lead to families underinvesting in high quality programs. Again, we would be better off with more public provision of these programs. And then the same thing happens at the other end of the education spectrum with higher education, that we put more and more of the cost of higher education onto students. And that leads, again, to people underinvesting in higher education, not enough people going to college because the costs are too high, people going to low quality programs, and then people finishing college with a lot of debt that leads them to distort their decisions later on. Again, we would all be better off if there were more public investment in higher education.
Thanks so much for that overview, Jesse. And, it's interesting to kind of hear you talking through these policies one by one, because kind of throughout the essay, you lay out some very discrete, very common sense proposals. And it seems kind of like a small step to adopt each of these common sense things. But I want to encourage our audience to kind of take a step back when they're thinking about what you've laid out here, and look at the full package of proposals. And when you do that, you actually see a radical idea, right? So what you're proposing is to take some of the very biggest ticket items on a household balance sheet and transfer them to the government balance sheet. So this is a really bold suggestion, and I want to talk about why it's worth undertaking. So what are individuals gaining and what are we gaining as a society?
Sure. I think one way to answer that is to think back to one of the ways we've done this very successfully, or a couple of the ways we've done this very successfully. And we did these decades ago. When we introduced Social Security, we took the idea of retirement income off of the family balance sheet. And we said, look, it doesn't make sense to require old people to live in poverty just because they didn't manage to save enough or something went wrong with their savings. And so we said, we're going to create a government program that will guarantee us, and we're all better off for that. It's one of the most successful programs we have. We did the same thing with Medicare a few decades later. And those both are successful, and we can't imagine a modern society without them. But there are a lot of other costs that are now important components of family expenses and that really reduce family well-being that are in the same category. That there's no economic efficiency argument for having families bear these costs. In fact, it often leads to inefficiency. It leads to inflexibility in our labor market as people refuse better jobs because they can't afford to give up their existing health insurance. It leads to people having to save in case a recession comes along and then be ruined because they didn't save enough when that happens. All of these are just big risks that make everybody worse off. And while we're working on trying to figure out how to make the labor market return better wages to workers, we also need to figure out ways to help people's wages go farther and make sure that we're fixing aspects of the labor market that limit people from pursuing high wages or from pursuing work. And I think each of these are areas where the current arrangement of just leaving it to families and staying out of it is not one we would have chosen. And if only we had had the foresight to develop or expand programs for these decades ago, we would be in better shape. And we shouldn't be stuck with whatever we happened to do 40 or 80 years ago.
That's really helpful, Jesse. And I think it might be helpful also to kind of drill down into some of these specific areas. So in your opening remarks, you talked about long-term care insurance, which is an issue that's really coming to the forefront as both the US population is aging and also policymakers are really seriously engaging in a new way with questions about how the care economy functions. And so as you're talking about some of the shortcomings of our safety net, I know a lot of people look to the private market to kind of correct for those things. So I was wondering, with the example of long-term care insurance, can you talk about where the market is failing, and in addition, where our public system is failing?
Sure. So many people, as they age, have looked into the possibility of buying private long-term care insurance, and it is incredibly expensive. And it's partly because the insurance companies are making 20-year commitments about what they're going to pay down the road, and they don't know what long-term care will cost them. And so they have to charge really high prices to make sure that they cover that. And what that leads to is a lot of families say, look, I can't afford this. I'm just going to go without and take my chances. And I know that if I get sick and really need it, well, either I can make my daughter quit her job and take care of me, or I can spend down all my assets and go on Medicaid. And neither of those are good outcomes, and neither of those incentives are not helpful incentives for us. There's nothing we want people to be doing to lower their risk of needing long-term care that they're not already doing. And so there's no incentive or moral hazard argument for leaving this to families. But that's what we're doing right now, and we'd be just better off if we said, well, look, this is a risk we all face. If long-term care is expensive in 20 years, that's a risk that we as a society face, and we as a society should figure out how to bear that.
Yeah. And so what do you see as the policy solution there?
I think in that case, we ought to expand the public provision of long-term care coverage and not require you to have zero assets in order to qualify. That just leads to all sorts of distorted behavior that makes our economy worse. We ought to expect that many people, all but the very richest people, will rely on public provision if they need it. Mm-hmm. Obviously, we hope they don't need it, but we all hope that we don't need it, and some of us wind up needing it anyway. And we ought to expect that it'll be high quality. One of the consequences of it operating through Medicaid is that it's often not very high quality, even though, in fact, many families that were middle class in their lifetimes wind up on this program that's intended for the poor. we need to think of this as a program for all of us.
Mhm. Yeah. So kind of extending that social protection up the income ladder in this case. At the same
In fact, it's already there. It's just done in a very bad way.
Right.
Because long-term care is so expensive, people pretty high up the income ladder end up having to rely on the existing public insurance program for it. But by the time they're using it, it's too late for them to make changes to what they require.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, as I hear you describing the changes to long-term care insurance that would really improve people's quality of life, it makes me want to kind of pull on a thread that you were highlighting in your last answer, which is about kind of what this suite of policy reforms does for people's kind of standard of living, right? So the theme of this volume is policy interventions that raise wages. And your essay tacks back and forth, looking at policy changes that affect both take-home income from time on the job, but also affecting these living standards a little bit more broadly, which I walked away from your essay and I thought, what is a wage? But why do we care about wages? So I was wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about how in your work, you're approaching the concept of wages, compensation more broadly, and living standards, and how kind of some of the policies that you look at could make interventions in all these different areas.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. We take the view that a wage is how much of a quality of life you can afford for the amount of work you do. And if we change our system so that instead of paying, say, your health insurance costs out of your wage, we instead pay them for you, that's a wage increase, just like giving you more money in your wages. In the current system, if your health insurance costs go up, your wage went down because you have to pay those health insurance costs. And so we take the view that all of these programs that allow your paycheck to go farther are effectively wage increases. Many of them actually would lead to actual wage increase, to paycheck increases as well, because they limit the extent to which these risks are distorting people's behavior and forcing them to stay in jobs or to stay out of the labor market in order to cover things that they shouldn't need to cover. So we talk a lot about job lock and health insurance, that people stay in jobs because they've got good health insurance and can't afford the risk of starting a new business or something like that where they wouldn't have such good insurance. You also think about parents, largely mothers, who stay out of the labor force or work part-time because they don't make enough to pay for high quality childcare. All of those, if we fix these, if we had better programs for these, you'd have more people working and more people earning.
Right. Yeah. And so, I mean, I like this phrase that you're using, the paycheck increase, right? So we're thinking about all these different ways that we can affect compensation and living standards through these social safety net reforms, but then also thinking very specifically about how much money people are taking home in their paychecks. And I think, right, that example that you're talking through with childcare and early childhood education as allowing mothers in particular to work is a way that, right, the paycheck can go from zero to something. But I think it's also a really interesting space for intervention when we think also about how that provision might affect the next generation of workers. Can you speak to that a little?
Sure. So right now, where we leave it to families, many families aren't able to afford high quality care. There's often an undersupply of good programs in many areas. And so you wind up with lots of pretty low quality programs. And we have increasing evidence that quality early childhood education just has long-term benefits in terms of how successful students are in school and then how successful they are later in life. And so a system that leads many families to be forced into low quality programs is making us poorer decades down the road, making us worse off. It's leading to higher crime rates down the road, in decades in the future, and fewer workers and fewer college graduates and lower earnings. If we figured out systems, and some states have done this, to provide universal access to high quality early child care and education, that would lead to more human capital development and a wealthier society when those children are grown.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think it makes me also think, taking zooming back again to look at this full suite of proposals all together, and the really carefully laid out common sense justification that you make for each of them. So I think you really make a convincing case that it makes economic sense to make this transfer from household balance sheets to government balance sheets. And then I think probably everyone who's in the audience today is listening and thinking about like how these changes would actually affect their household budgets in a positive way, whether it's long-term care insurance, more funding for childcare. So my question for you is, this all makes sense. It all sounds great. So why haven't we done it yet, right? So are there unspoken drawbacks that we should speak out loud so that policymakers can address them in the policies that they're crafting? Or are there maybe political log jams that are preventing us from moving forward? Like, why isn't it done? It sounds great.
I mean, I think a lot of it is political, that it's just hard to build new programs, and we don't do it very often, and we do it in spurts, and then we leave things alone. And as the economy has changed in recent decades, that has calls for a different set of programs, but we don't really reset the way we think about this very often. And so we stick with the set of programs we had in the 1960s. And so I think that's much of what we would need to do. Many of these, if the government is going to provide these, we are going to need to raise taxes. So there's no way around that. In the cases we highlight, we believe that typical families would be better off paying more taxes in order to get this insurance coverage or this public provision. And so we think it's a trade worth making, but there is resistance to raising taxes. I think one aspect of this is that because our economy has gotten so unequal, almost any way of raising the taxes to pay for it is going to lead to some redistribution. I think that would be a good response given how unequal our economy is, but that does lead to some people opposing it.
And Raina, so, you know, one thing that you're talking about is this is a politically challenging thing to do because of the revenue raising part of this, and that we're kind of like a little bit in an impasse, looking for a policy window. And I guess I'm just, as my last question for you, wondering if you see this COVID crisis as a potential break in this kind of logjam.
I think it potentially is. I mean, I think we've for a long time accepted that even though we had a very minimal unemployment insurance system, so you could barely get by if you lost your job, that basically any serious recession was going to ruin millions of families because they were going to lose their jobs, and unemployment insurance would make up less than half of what they lost, and that would just be that, and that was their problem. And I think we learned in the COVID crisis that we don't have to do it that way, that we can have unemployment insurance that is much more protective. I think that will lead to some, that does create an opportunity to make that not an emergency thing that we do once in 100 years, but something that we do as a regular way to help protect families from the cost of recessions.
Well, unemployment insurance is my favorite social insurance program, so I'm so happy to close on that note. I want to thank you, Jesse, for a really great conversation, and to thank both you and Sandy for a really fabulous essay, changing the way that we think about the social safety net.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so now I'm so thrilled that we're going to bring back all three authors for a Q&A session, which will be moderated by Catherine Zekure, our really talented labor market policy analyst here at Equitable Growth.
Thanks again, Alex. We're back for a final Q&A period with Dr. Ioana Marinescu, Dr. Andria Smythe, and Dr. Jesse Rothstein. And so while we finish gathering questions from the audience, and so there's still time for folks to put those questions in the Q&A box, I just wanted to see if there was anything, if any of the other panelists had anything in their fireside chats that resonated with you, because I know a lot of your essays touch on some similar themes and trends.
Maybe I'll kick this off by picking up on something that Kate Bond asked in the Q&A, which is one connection between these is that I kind of some of the policies that I talk about in my essay with Sandy Black are, we argue that they will reduce the kind of extent to which the people are locked into their jobs. And Kate asks whether this would reduce monopsony power. And I think it absolutely would. I think there are lots of sources of monopsony power in the labor market. But one of them is that when we tie so much of our safety net to the employer, it makes it hard for workers to leave a job that is no longer the right fit for them. And that gives employers bargaining power that they can use to reduce wages.
And I would add that in a part of my essay where I talked about this tension between tuition and labor supply, for a lot of working students, higher education provides an appropriate alternative to work because they're investing in human capital. And when tuition is so high that individuals have no choice but to work these jobs that have unpredictable scheduling and low wages. So these student workers are more likely to accept a lot of labor market conditions that they would not have otherwise if college were more accessible and affordable.
Yeah, no, thanks. And Andrea, actually, one of the questions from the Q&A was about debt cancellation, because that's something that we're talking about right now. What impact would that have for pursuing higher ed for lower income students going forward?
So I mentioned this idea where for a lot of students who are workers, they're trying to escape the student debt trap, right? A lot of students are debt averse. And so they're trying to escape the student debt trap, but then they find themselves in this low wage, high tuition trap as well. So just relieving that constraint on students will, one, allow them to pursue higher education without the trap of the debt hanging over their heads. But then debt also, affects students' decisions once they're full-time in the labor market, right? So it affects what type of jobs they train for. It affects how much they work, whether they are more likely to continue on with postgraduate studies. So debt really affects students' decisions about higher education in ways that are not the best in the sense of a public good perspective.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed how, no, thank you. And I really enjoyed, Andrea, how your essay and your talk overlapped with Jesse's so much on this about these types of public good investments that we have always or have started treating as private investments and private responsibilities for individuals, even though they might not be the best equipped to handle those investments, or just because they're just wonderful public benefits for all of us. Jesse, I was curious if there were any other, I was curious if you had any thoughts on debt, because so much of the policies you talk about sort of on the other side of the balance sheet, but yeah, what does debt mean in this conversation?
So, I mean, student debt this is a giant hole that we've fallen into, that we really, you can see how we got here, but if you'd known we were going to wind up here 20 years ago, you would have said, absolutely not, let's stop this, let's do something different, this isn't going to work. And right now we're coming up with all these ways of trying to fix the problem of many, many people who went to college, which we want most students to go to college. They went to college, they took on a lot of debt that they'll never be able to repay, and it's going to hang over their lives through much of their adult lives. We're trying to figure out ways to fix that. We have to fix it, but we shouldn't be here. And we need to figure out other ways of financing college. My view is fundamentally the problem is that we haven't built enough public colleges in the last 30, 40 years. That the population has grown, and our expectations about how many people will go to college have gone way up. And it's always been the case that we've relied on public colleges for the vast majority of higher education. But we haven't expanded the systems enough to keep up with what we want the demand to be. And that's led to rising costs, rising pressure, more people relying on for-profit colleges, which are generally not very high quality, and taking on lots of debt to do it. We need to be building and funding public higher education to fill this need.
No, yeah, thank you. That's the supply is a really interesting point that you make in your essay. And so I actually want to pivot a bit and ask Ioana. We've had a lot of interest in talking about monopsony in the Q&A, and one of the questions I wanted to start with is something we've spoken a little bit about before, but antitrust legislation, the question begins, is reactive. So what are some more proactive ways to address this concentration and to create competitive jobs to break monopsony power?
Right. So it's true that antitrust action is reactive. However, let's not forget that there's an important deterrence effect of any kind of enforcement, meaning that, even though right now we are dealing with a behavior that already happened and we're trying to pursue that legally, seeing that other employers, and there's actually work showing that this is actually happening as far as other types of violations against labor by Matt Johnson. And so when employers see that, they are less likely to engage in those behaviors at the same time. So I think it also has, in that way, a broader impact, not just on what already happened, but in discouraging further bad behavior. And then that's why also I was talking about these other options regarding increasing the minimum wage or boosting worker bargaining power through things like unions that are more, broad in a sense, and are two different ways of tackling the monopsony power of employers that leads to wage suppression. So, with the minimum wage, you'd act directly on the wage, but then you're only affecting the lowest paid workers by definition of the minimum wage. Or with unions or other ways of boosting worker bargaining power, it would be more general and would serve as a counterweight to the employer bargaining power that is generated for the various reasons that we discussed earlier in terms of opportunities. And, like Jesse was saying, for example, workers, among other things, might have a certain need for certain benefits that employers are providing, and that makes it harder for them to switch jobs. And so that's another way that I didn't mention, but I agree could help with enhancing competition by not tying some of those benefits to employers and thereby allowing workers more easily to switch employers without worrying about loss of coverage for different benefits.
Mm-hmm. Oh, great, thank you. And sort of staying on this question of competition, different labor markets. Another question in the chat was how the map that you showed that there were a lot of areas of the country. I think possibly 60% of labor markets, ERSA said, that have highly concentrated labor markets, which means there aren't very many employer options for workers. And so what percentage of workers or employment does that translate to? Because these are largely rural areas.
That's right. So, and because they're rural areas, that represents a much smaller share of workers, and namely the share of workers is 16% that are working in those labor markets, which is non-negligible, but it's still indeed a smaller share than 60%. So, so that's indeed the case. Now, just to put that in perspective, as we also mentioned during the talk, the concentration is just one aspect of employer power. As we discussed, for example, right now, another aspect is that jobs are just not interchangeable in terms of the benefits they provide, the proximity to home, and so on and so forth. And that we can measure through what I was talking earlier about, which is the worker sensitivity to wages. So if you were underpaid, how willing would you be or able to change jobs? And in another paper we've written looking at the biggest labor markets, the most common jobs in the US, we find that workers are not very sensitive to wages, so much so that employers, that workers could be as much as 17% more productive than their wages. And I'm talking here about common occupations across the whole of the US. So just the bottom line is that even though concentration, once you weigh by employment, high concentration markets are minority, but a substantial minority, that's not the only source of employer monopsony power. And we know from just looking at workers' sensitivity to wages that on average, this sensitivity is fairly low, allowing employers to underpay most people. And I also want to add for our audience, which is quite interesting, that there isn't a very large and systematic difference by education. So that really affects everybody. if you're a highly paid individual, you're just as likely, more or less, to be underpaid because, just if you think about some of your own situation here, highly educated people, number of them, you can immediately see that there's just not that many options out there that would be could easily replace your current job. So on average, the wage sensitivity is quite similar. It varies by profession, just to be clear. So there's a lot of variation, but it's not like high wage or highly educated people are less sensitive or more sensitive. It's kind of broadly the same, and therefore everybody's affected by this, not just people in more rural areas. It's just a very broad-based phenomenon.
No, exactly. And something that came out through in different ways throughout all three of these essays, and some of the essays that are not, some of the essay authors are not spotlighted in this event, is how we're often talking about these broad national policies, but they can have very different impacts at the regional or state or local level. Actually, one of the other essays that I think dovetails very well with Ioana's is by Robert Manduka at the University of Michigan, that talks similarly about using universal place-conscious policies like antitrust to address geographic disparities. But actually also wanted to pull out a bit more. I'm curious if any of you have thoughts on that, about how these investments or dynamics play out differently at sort of state, local, regional levels. But Andria, I wanted to put you on the spot a bit, and because you've talked a little bit about land-grant universities and what it means historically, but also what it means to invest in, what it can mean for a city or town to invest in a university and in their higher education system.
Right. So for a lot of localities, the higher education institution is the largest employer, right? Usually it's, especially if it's a research institution, they always also have a medical school attached to it. And that's one of a huge source of direct employment for a lot of people in the surrounding areas. But not just that, the research is showing that a lot of the returns to research, and just having that physical presence of a university, confer a lot of benefits to the immediate surrounding areas, and then areas close to that university town, or towns close to university and higher ed institutions. So even not just thinking about the future labor market of more college graduates, but the immediate returns of being close to a university is large for the surrounding areas. So you can think of localities that do not have that presence are at a disadvantage.
And yeah, Ioana, I think also in your essay you make the point that there's that these, the greater employer concentration in these more rural areas also makes case for why, as you said, raising the minimum wage is especially needed in some of those areas.
Right, and in general, if you were going to, as in this other essay, there was a suggestion to have these benefits that are locally conscious by directing additional, so to speak, stimulus to these areas. Hopefully it would create more jobs and allow new businesses to be created, which would both sort of in the quantity of jobs, we know that helps, but also potentially reducing concentration by creating additional types of options for workers. And so, this is something that is a new additional benefit of having more employers, is not just that we get more jobs, but we got more different employers who are vying for workers, thereby improving workers' options and their ability to command higher wages, or at the minimum to get a job that they like better by simply having more choices. And that's also where having a good local university itself could stimulate business creation, which again would have positive spillover effects on the local population.
And Jesse, I'm afraid we're out of time, so I don't have time to ask you about local childcare markets, but another time.
Sure.
So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. So I would just like to thank all three of our panelists here today, Ioana Marinescu, Andria Smythe, and Jesse Rothstein, along with our keynote speaker, Congressman Bobby Scott, for taking the time to join us today. I'd also like to thank my Equitable Growth colleagues. Today you saw Kate Vaughn, Liz Hipple, and Alex Goldworth, for moderating their fireside chats earlier. Also, I'd like to thank the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment, the Bernard and Spitzer Charitable Trust, and all of our colleagues behind the scenes, Equitable Growth, who made this book and event possible. So one more time, this is launch event for our book. The essays discussed here today, along with 7 others, are all part of this new book. It's out today, Boosting Wages for U.S. Workers in the New Economy. That's on our website at equitablegrowth.org. They explore lots of different ways to raise wages by addressing the underlying structures and dynamics in our economy, both through social labor policy and through other avenues, such as some we've discussed here today, like higher education, but also through other avenues like corporate tax policy, macroeconomic policy, and many others. So I really hope you'll take a chance to check it out. The ebooks and all 10 individual essays are available again at equitablegrowth.org.